Today we are going to continue the examination of political topography and examine the idea of a third position. Specifically, I will present the findings on Adolf Hitler's political self-assessment in Rainer Zitelmann's PhD thesis and book, Hitler, The Policies of Seduction. This will fulfill a dual purpose of both providing an understanding of Hitler and National Socialism, as well as support the model of the trichotomy discussed in previous videos. In the political trichotomy, Hitler can be viewed as a right-wing politician in a tripolar model with the typical left-right axis overlaid on top of it. Hitler himself presents some ideas that can confirm this assessment, although some people may see them as contrary. Although this argument will likely not be settled by this video, reviewing Zitelmann's work can at least provide some useful information. Quoting page 447, quote, Hitler, by the way, never regarded himself as being a right-wing politician, nor, of course, as left-wing, but as a revolutionary who, in a situation in which none of the great social classes and political streams was able to assert itself, had created a third platform in National Socialism, a synthesis between nationalism and socialism. End quote. Hitler, throughout his political career, viewed himself in opposition to both left and right. In a speech on February 17, 1922, Hitler declared, quote, whether we stood up 1,000 times against the regime of Wilhelm II, for the Marxist we are still reactionary monarchists, thanks to a mendacious press. Whether we fight against Bolshevism, and we are the only ones who really fight, for the nationalists we remain Bolshevists. In this way, from right to left, there is nothing but a great lie. End quote. And in an interview on August 16, 1932, Hitler said, quote, certain right-wing circles call us Bolshevists, and the Bolshevists in their turn claim we are reactionaries, barons, big capitalists, serfs of entrepreneurs, and God knows what else. The internal Marxist enemies of Germany know, after their years-long deception of the German people, that the National Socialist movement will really honestly take care of the German working person. The bourgeois reactionaries know that we will replace their policy of weakness by a policy of national strength. Both suspect that the time of class and special interest battles is approaching its end, and that on the ideological platform of National Socialism, the German nation will be given back its unity. End quote. As we can see, Hitler identified opposition from both left-wing and right-wing German political entities. Other sources confirm such opposition as well. For example, the report on a speech on October 26, 1920 reads, quote, now Hitler turned to the right and left. The national right lacked a social concept, the social left a national one. He admonished the right-wing parties. If you want to be national, then climb down to your people and away with all this class conceit. To the left, he called, you who have declared your solidarity with the whole world, first show your solidarity with your own national comrades. Become Germans first. Is this the way the heroes look who intend to destroy the world, but crawl before the foreign nations in fear that something might be taken amiss out there? You who are truly revolutionaries, come over to us and fight with us for our whole nation. Your place is not over there as drovers for international capital, but with us, with your nation. End quote. In this, we can see the beginnings of how Hitler intends to build his National Socialist German Workers' Party. In another speech on November 19, 1920, Hitler said that his party, quote, was not fighting against the right or left, but was taking what was valuable from both sides, end quote. In this, we can see how in the model of the trichotomy, Hitler can end up so distant from both the socialist and capitalist poles, and yet still be accused of belonging to either. It becomes more clear when examining other quotations. Citing page 406, on September 6, 1921, in a letter, quote, Hitler declared that the party was not being built up by mergers with other national popular groupings, but by gaining the forces of the extreme left and extreme right, quote, but there is no value in joining up with such weak formations. What we need is to attract powerful masses, preferably from the extreme left and extreme right wing, end quote. Hitler regarded only the truly extreme force, the idealist of the extreme right and extreme left, as being suitable for the new movement, end quote. In a speech on September 28, 1922, Hitler said, quote, in the ranks of us National Socialists, the disinherited from the right and left must come together, end quote. In another speech on February 26, 1923, Hitler declared, quote, "Our movement must comprise both extremes, left and right," end quote. As we can see, Hitler viewed his movement as a synthesis between the extremes of both left and right. He was not merely between them in the sense of being in the center, but a new extreme built by taking elements from both, as we can see reflected in his position on this chart of the trichotomy. In the same speech on February 26, 1923, Hitler continued on the subjects of the national and social. Quote, "Our task will be to give our nation a national feeling again, and to unite this with social happiness, because with us, only he will be national who is aware of his highest social obligations, while we will only be able to call him social who is national in the truest sense of the word. For this reason, the two extremes are flowing together in our movement, the communists from the left, and the students, the officers, from the right. Both were the most active elements, and it was the greatest of crimes that both once stood opposed to each other in street battles." End quote. Hitler reiterated his position on the political axis in future speeches. At a rally on April 24, 1923, Hitler said, "So today our movement is the sharpest extreme against two extremes." End quote. He also wrote in Mein Kampf that his movement should appeal to, quote, "many inclining to the fanatical extreme of the left side," end quote, and that it should recruit adherents, quote, "from mostly very extreme Weltanschauung," end quote. Beyond merely recruiting from extremes and being positioned against extremes, Hitler viewed National Socialism as a synthesis of these extremes. When describing the National Socialists in a speech on February 24, 1930, he said, quote, "Their name already unites two extreme terms, the national and the socialist, joined together in one word," end quote. On May 26, 1944, he said, quote, "I attempted to define a new term under the motto that in the end, nationalism and socialism are the same under one condition, namely, that the nation moves into the center of all desire. In those days I had heavy battles both from the left as well as from the right," end quote. On July 28, 1922, he had said, quote, "Any truly national idea is social in the final analysis. That means whoever is prepared to commit himself to his nation so completely that he truly does not have any higher ideal than only the well-being of this, his nation, whoever has understood our great song, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, in such a way that there is nothing in the world for him which stands higher than this Germany, people and land, land and people, is a socialist," end quote. On January 29, 1923, Hitler said that the national concept, quote, "is identical for us Germans with the socialist one. The more fanatically national we are, the more we must take the welfare of the national community to heart. That means the more fanatically socialist we become," end quote. To elaborate on what this synthesis meant exactly to Hitler, we can examine his definitions of nationalism and socialism further. Hitler rejected the bourgeois definition of nationalism and the Marxist definition of socialism. On nationalism, Hitler said on August 13, 1920, quote, "But what is the meaning of this term? What does nationalism mean? If I wish to be national, this means that I want to serve this people, and if I want to serve a people, this can only mean that I want to contribute to this nation surviving, that it can preserve its existence, that it earns its daily bread, and that it can continue to develop, physically and spiritually. But if I want to be national in this sense, then I must understand that the future of our German nation will only develop favorably if we lead a people which is healthy into this future," end quote. On socialism, Hitler in the same speech said that its purpose was, quote, "to improve the fate of the masses, to lift them, to give them bread, and culturally raise them. The purpose of socialism should also be that within it a people become healthy, that the people rise upwards in this socialism. And if I recognize that socialism should not be a phrase of a party, but a teaching for the uplifting of the poorest, the most lowly of a nation, the improvement of their situation in life, then I must understand that I will only achieve that if the whole national community is prepared to do this, if a whole nation places itself at the service of this movement," end quote. In Hitler's mind, through his redefinition of these terms, they are synthesized as one. Again, in the same speech, his, quote, "changing around of these two terms, socialism and nationalism," end quote, meant, quote, in reality a coming together of both, because what then occurs, socialism becomes nationalism, nationalism socialism. They are both one, socialism and nationalism. They are the greatest fighters for their own people, are the greatest fighters in the fight for existence here on Earth, and with this, they are no longer battle cries against each other, but a battle cry which shapes its life according to this motto: we do not recognize pride of estate just as little as pride of class. We know only one pride, namely to be the servants of a people. End quote. On November 13th, 1930, he said that, quote, if we burden the term socialism with all of the dogma which social democracy and the Communist Party have put into the term, and if we burden the term nationalism with all of the dogma which the bourgeois parties have put into it, then the terms actually are absolutely divisive. But that is not necessary and does not lie in the terms themselves. I do not have to link the term socialism to any ideas the Social Democratic Party has put into it, and I do not need to identify the term nationalism with opinions of the present bourgeois parties. On the contrary, these terms should be cleansed of foreign additives. End quote. In this cleansing, a third position is created. On November 8th, 1930, Hitler said, quote, the two existing concepts have become paralyzed. There is only one possibility, to create a third concept, and on this third platform, to newly reunite the German nation. End quote. We can see how this third position can place National Socialism on a pole apart from the two-dimensional left-right axis, and how based on Hitler's rhetoric, trying to fit him and National Socialism onto a single left-right axis is very difficult, if not impossible. Hitler's attachment to extremes makes it clear that one cannot simply place him in the middle, in a centrist position. Placing him alongside centrists is nonsensical. Clearly Hitler is extreme, but which extreme? The conventional right-wing position cannot be upheld given the association with the left. The position that National Socialism is self-contradictory and therefore illegitimate and unnecessary to analyze can also not be upheld after a careful study. Rather than trying to coerce our understanding into a somewhat arbitrary system, or simply remove it from analysis entirely, we can try to find a better way to understand National Socialism. If we look at the graphic for the trichotomy, the author placed Hitler about where one might expect. Perhaps he could be moved a bit more towards Stalin, and perhaps Stalin towards Hitler, but overall the analysis basically works, and succeeds in differentiating the two from each other. If we look at the political compass that is widely used online, it places Stalin and Hitler roughly on the same Y value on the authoritarian axis, and very far apart on the economic axis. This only differentiates them by saying that Stalin preferred much greater economic control than did Hitler. It doesn't at all capture their motivations for economic control and how they would use their authority. By using three poles rather than two axes, their contrast is made more clear. One might argue that Hitler should be placed directly between these poles of socialism and nationalism, given that this represents a perfect synthesis of these terms, but if we consider how Hitler himself redefined these, it's clear that he belongs more towards the absolutist pole rather than the communist one. It is also important to remember that no political model has absolute correctness. However, the ability to easily categorize a historical figure who defies classification in typical models gives credence to the utility of the trichotomy. In this model, we can see that neither Hitler nor Stalin were motivated to facilitate a free market as a value in of itself, and that their systems of control had divergent ends. This reflects the historical and contemporary recognition of their simultaneous close similarities and extreme differences. It could be argued that political conflicts trend towards a dichotomy, but perhaps during periods of heavy political transformation, as I believe we are currently in, more advanced models are necessary. One could even argue for a fourth pole to be added for religion, creating a tetrahedral model, but as discussed in the previous video, if one accepts the neo-reactionary interpretation of this system, the communist pole is the religious pole already, in a degenerate condition. As far as the idea of left and right goes, I leave it up to the viewer to make that determination. Hitler strongly dissociates himself from both left and right, yet on the trichotomy he ends up on the right. If one believes that he does not belong on the right, then one solution to this problem is to move Hitler more towards the center of the communist nationalist poles, which places him in the center of the left-right axis, but also at an extreme composed of extremes, as he would classify himself. However, as we discussed, this doesn't necessarily make sense given his definition of these terms socialism and nationalism. Another solution is simply to reject the idea of superimposing the left-right axis over this chart in the first place. Yet another is to say that Hitler was wrong in his own self-assessment and that he is, in fact, right-wing. Even further, we could say that the understanding of left and right has changed, and while Hitler was not right-wing in his own time, he retroactively appears to be by our modern standards. In terms of considering that Hitler was in fact right-wing, one might consider that left-wing people never seem to disagree with the idea that Hitler was right-wing, but right-wingers do. You could simply say that this is a bias to dispose one's side of a wretched figure, but this behavior is actually in line with what the trichotomy would predict. On a simple left-right axis, you'd expect the right to also deny association with Hitler to the same degree as the left does, and yet some are willing to accept the idea that Hitler was right-wing. You could argue that the left and right behave fundamentally differently, or that the right wing has been propagandized to accept the burden of Hitler, but I think the explanation provided by the trichotomy presents a more elegant and likely explanation, and that is, as discussed, that the right shares two opposite poles, and that Hitler is very near one of these extremes. Ultimately, I think that this question of left versus right is interesting, but not very useful. On the contrary, I think the trichotomy gives us an excellent understanding of Hitler's position. Also useful is this idea of a third position, which is something that has been advocated by many political and economic thinkers. Whether or not such a position really exists or is simply a phantom of post hoc rationalization requires further study. However, at the very least, you now have an idea of at least one possibility of what such a position is. Whether or not a third position is necessarily National Socialist or of a similar ideology also requires further research. If you are very interested in this topic, the book I used to make this video presents a compelling body of research on Hitler. It is also worth noting, especially for skeptics, that a great amount of that context is missing from this video. While we have mostly presented facts on Hitler's self-understanding, there is a large amount of background that confirms the validity of his self-assessment. Again, the book is titled Hitler, the Policies of Seduction by Rainer Zitelmann. With that, I defer to the audience for comments. A final consideration, it's possible that, simply due to the subject matter here, that YouTube deletes this video, or even worse, the entire channel, so I remind you that all of my videos are automatically backed up to BitChute, and I do get notifications when people comment there. That and all of my social media will be linked below. I don't think YouTube will actually delete the video or channel, since this video is purely an academic study and not advocating anything, but these days you never know. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you around.